We can start. Good morning, and welcome to the second day of our conference on the neo-Kantian reception of Schiller. And I'm very happy to share this session, and we'll start with a talk by Scott Edgar. Scott Edgar is a professor at St. Mary's University, Halifax, in Canada. And so he specializes in 19th century German philosophy, neo-Kantianism, and the history and philosophy of science. He has published a lot on the topics we speak about on Hermann Cohen, and also on the intersection between analytic philosophy and the neo-Kantian tradition. So the title of his talk today is different from the one you find in the brochure, and it's Play and Nominal Affection in Hermann Cohen's Schillerian Aesthetics. So without further ado, I leave the floor to you, Scott.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Francesco, and thank you, Chiara, for organizing such a fantastic conference. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk this morning about some foundational concepts in Hermann Cohen's aesthetics, and I want to emphasize how much, at several different important points, Cohen articulates those concepts by drawing self-consciously and explicitly on Schiller. I'm only going to be talking about Cohen's. Thank you. I'm only going to be talking about Kant's Foundation of Aesthetics, which he published in 1889. Cohen has a lot to say about Schiller in his aesthetic writings from both before and after Kant's Foundation, but it seems to me that he draws especially robustly on Schiller in important ways in Kant's Foundation, or at least that's a case that I hope to make. And I'm going to be talking exclusively about the case that Cohen makes for his account of aesthetic consciousness and its place in his system of critical idealism. And he makes that case in chapters 1, 2, and 4 of Kant's Foundation. Chapters 1 and 2 of the book are where he develops his account of aesthetic consciousness systematically, more or less in his own voice. But then there are key concepts of his aesthetics that he continues to develop in more detail in chapter 4. And chapter 4 is where Cohen compares and contrasts his own views to the aesthetic views of other post-Kantian philosophers. And in that chapter, he draws quite explicitly on Goethe and especially on Schiller to add detail to his own accounts of his own key concepts. Now, for my part, this morning, I want to do two things. So first, I'm going to argue that for Cohen, play is a rational ideal that requires us continually to deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. And of course, I'll say more about exactly what that means as we go. But in order to argue that, it's going to require me to develop a relatively fine-grained interpretation of Cohen's account of feeling as distinctive aesthetic content, the account he gives in Kant's Foundation. But then second, I want to use the interpretation I develop to show how, at multiple important points, Cohen develops his account by drawing explicitly and self-consciously on Schiller. And I'm going to give you a warning right at the outset that in order to do these two things, I'm going to have to touch on various concepts of Cohen's that are drawn from all of the corners of his critical idealism, including the concepts of universal communicability and universal validity, his concept of the will, his concepts of things in themselves and noumenal affection, and finally, his concept of play, or what Schiller calls the play drive. So here's the plan. First, I'm going to go very quickly through one fundamental way in which Cohen's aesthetics follows Schiller's aesthetics more closely than it follows Kant's, namely Cohen's argument that play involves the interaction between, on the one hand, the cognitive faculties of what Cohen calls theoretical consciousness, and on the other hand, the will, or what Cohen more typically calls moral consciousness. For Cohen, play just is the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. And I'm going to argue that means that for Cohen, play just is the mutual interdependence of theoretical and moral consciousness. Then, if this talk were going to be considerably longer, I would do this second section about how Cohen thinks moral consciousness depends on theoretical consciousness and how that dependence involves things in themselves. But this morning, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this section. It's the least important section of the talk. Much more important is this third section. So I'm going to give a detailed account of how, for Cohen, theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness, and how that dependence relation involves noumenal affection. And then fourth, I'll make the case that for Cohen, play is a rational ideal that requires us continually to deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. And then finally, I'll conclude very briefly by pulling these pieces together and just trying to re-emphasize the ways in which Cohen develops all of the ideas I've been talking about by drawing on Schiller. So that's the plan. Here's part one, play and Kant, Schiller, and Cohen. So let me start by going much too quickly over one fundamental respect in which Cohen's aesthetics follows Schiller's, and in particular Schiller's from the aesthetic letters, more closely than Cohen follows Kant. To start with, there are a number of ways that Cohen's aesthetics follows Kant's and Schiller's both on pretty much all the points where Kant and Schiller agree. So, for example, Cohen follows both Kant and Schiller in thinking that there is a question about the place of aesthetics in the critical philosophical system. Cohen follows both Kant and Schiller in arguing that the object of aesthetics is feeling. And he follows Kant and Schiller in arguing that feeling is not independent of both nature and morality. And finally, Cohen follows both Kant and Schiller in arguing that play is central to an explanation of how feeling, the distinct object of aesthetics, is generated. But now we come to a deeper question, the question of exactly what play is. And on this point, there's an important disagreement between Kant and Schiller, and Cohen follows Schiller on this point, not Kant. So for Kant, play is, of course, the free play of the faculties of imagination and understanding, that is, two cognitive faculties, or faculties of what Cohen calls theoretical consciousness. On Kant's view, play does not involve the will or any moral considerations. But for Schiller, play, or what in the aesthetic letters he calls the play drive, does involve the will. Schiller's account of play begins with his contrast between the sense drive and the form drive. And he associates the sense drive with matter and the form drive with form. He associates the sense drive with what is finite and changing in a human being, and he associates the form drive with what is infinite and unchanging in a human being. And I'll just say right now that I do not know how to interpret in detail how all of these different pieces of the form drive and the sense drive fit together for Schiller. But fortunately for me, that doesn't matter. Because what matters is another contrast that Schiller associates with the form drive and the sense drive. Schiller associates the sense drive with the phenomenal self. That is, the self that is an object of theoretical knowledge and that is subject to deterministic causal laws. And he associates the form drive with the self that is both rational and free, that is the noumenal self. But then for Schiller, the play drive is the unification of the form drive and the sense drive. It is the unification of these two opposing sides of humanity. So, and this is the important part for my purposes. For Schiller, the play drive is the unification of the phenomenal self, which is an object of theoretical cognition, and the noumenal self, which is free and rational and has the possibility of being ethical. So starting in chapter 1 of Kant, let me just come back to Cohen then. That's Schiller. So Cohen defends an account of play that, in this respect, explicitly follows Schiller rather than Kant. Starting in chapter 1 of Kant's Foundation and continuing into chapter 2, Cohen draws a distinction between what he calls two modes of consciousness: theoretical consciousness and moral consciousness. Theoretical consciousness includes our knowledge of the phenomenal world, including our knowledge of our phenomenal selves. Moral consciousness includes our awareness of the will, our awareness of its freedom, and our awareness of the possibility that the will is subject our awareness that the will is subject to the rational demands of morality. And play, on Cohen's account, is precisely the unification of these two modes of consciousness. It's the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. So for Cohen, like for Schiller and unlike for Kant, play involves the will. And in fact, on this point, I take my interpretation of Cohen up to this point simply to follow Professor Beiser's interpretation from your book on Cohen. So there's nothing original in my interpretation of Cohen so far. It's worth emphasizing that Cohen is explicit that on this important point about the point about how he interprets play in a way that is quite different than how Kant understands play. Cohen understands himself to be disagreeing with Kant. So he says, for example, this is Cohen, not only understanding and imagination are at play, Spielen dieses Spiel, but just as imagination itself plays over to the side of ideas, so the entire weight of moral consciousness must be incorporated into this proportion. By proportion, he means the proportion of theoretical and moral consciousness as unified in play. And as Cohen picks up the thread of this argument beyond the first two chapters of Kant's Foundation of Aesthetics, as he picks up this argument in chapter 4, Cohen is perfectly explicit that he understands himself to be following Schiller. So that's one really important debt that Cohen's aesthetics has to Schiller. And there are going to be more debts to Schiller, but to see them, we need to look more closely at the details of Cohen's account of the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. So what does Cohen think that unification actually consists in? Well, the short answer is that it consists in the mutual interdependence of theoretical and moral consciousness. To put that a little bit more precisely, play consists in, on the one hand, the fact that theoretical consciousness, in order to carry out its proper task, depends on moral consciousness. And conversely, moral consciousness, in order to carry out its proper task, depends on theoretical consciousness. So here is Cohen's way of putting this point. And I apologize, I'm almost certain that I'm missing very important words for this quotation. So I'm going to say them very loud when we get to the point where they're missing. So Cohen is talking about sort of the value of the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. And he says about the theoretical, he says about the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness, that it fulfills the concept of humanity so that without it, the value of science for man himself would be only sterile pride. And the dignity of freedom makes it at home in a realm of morals and ends only to make him alien to the world of phenomena to which he belongs as a being of nature. So this is Cohen's very short account of the interdependence of theoretical and moral consciousness. The long answer, which I hope is going to shed considerable light on exactly what Cohen means in this passage, that longer answer is what I'm going to spell out in more detail over the next sections. So first of all, there's a section in this paper about how moral consciousness depends on theoretical consciousness, and also how that dependence relation commits Cohen to noumenal affection. I'm going to skip that for the purposes of time. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A if anybody wants to. So let's get to section 3, how theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness and how that dependence involves noumenal affection. For what it's worth, the case that I have to make in this section is somewhat more complicated than the case in the previous section. But I think the example of theoretical consciousness depending, in order to carry out its task, depending on moral consciousness, is in some ways more interesting, and also it turns out to be more revealing of how Cohen is drawing on Schiller. So that's why I want to emphasize this section rather than section 2. Okay, so let me start with this question. What is the task of theoretical consciousness? Well, for Cohen, roughly, that task is to transform subjective representations, paradigmatically sensory contents, into knowledge that is universally valid and, in that sense, objective. Now, how does theoretical consciousness carry out that task? Here is where, in Kant's foundation of aesthetics, Cohen draws on Schiller. Cohen's account begins with a thorough discussion of the concept of universal communicability. That's a concept that Kant introduces in the Third Critique, but tellingly, Cohen passes entirely over Kant's discussion of universal communicability. And instead, he draws quite heavily on Schiller's account of it from lectures that Schiller gave about a year and a half before he wrote the Aesthetic Letters. So that's where Schiller says, and this is a quotation that, that Cohen quotes. So Schiller says, if a sensation of pleasure is to be universally communicable, everything empirical, material, and all influence of inclination must be separated from it. So universal communicability, on Cohen's interpretation of Schiller, is what transforms representations that are subjective and relative into representations that are universally valid and objective. It's what makes it possible for representations to be, as Schiller also puts it, common to all people. So universally valid. So that's universal communicability. But then Cohen immediately goes on to argue that for Schiller, universal communicability is connected to the play drive. In fact, Cohen puts a lot of emphasis precisely on the point that Schiller's concept of play, the play drive in the Aesthetic Letters, echoes in some important way and incorporates the idea of universal communicability that Schiller had discussed in his earlier lectures. And in fact, I think the very fact that Cohen worked so hard to connect universal communicability to the play drive tells us that Cohen thinks it's somehow important for the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. So presumably, universal communicability is important for how theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness. But what's the connection? What does universal communicability have to do with how theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness? So we get, I think, the beginning of an answer to this question in what I think is a really remarkable passage in Cohen, and a passage that I want to spend some time on. So Cohen is talking about play. He's talking about the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. And he says, if that unification were not established, then universal communicability would be thwarted and all theoretical understanding would become impossible. Here too, the criterion of universal communicability rests on the cooperation of the consciousness of movement and thus of the will for the projection that gives existence to the sound, and in this to the word, is a result of the direction of movement. I want to go over this passage very, very carefully. And the first thing to notice about this passage is what Cohen is describing in the last sentence that I've quoted here. He's talking about what it takes to speak, what it takes to convey meaning with words. And so what does it take to convey meaning with words? Well, we need to form words. And in order to do that, we need to make sounds. And in order to do that, we need to engage in certain kinds of movements, in particular, muscular contractions in the throat and the mouth. And to do that, we need acts of will. So from this picture, we get a tolerably clear picture of how theoretical consciousness depends on the will and therefore depends on moral consciousness. So remember, the task of theoretical consciousness is to generate knowledge that is universally valid. But the idea of universal validity presupposes universal communicability. It presupposes that the relevant representations can be shared between multiple epistemic subjects. But also, and here's the important part, that sharing can't take place without the will's action. For one subject to share an idea with other epistemic subjects, the first subject has to initiate some series of events that results in the other subjects coming to grasp the idea in question. And as Cohen suggests in this passage, the subject's will is what initiates the series of events that results in ideas being shared with others. So it follows that for theoretical consciousness to carry out its task of generating knowledge that is universally valid, that theoretical consciousness depends on the will's action. In other words, theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness. But I think there's more to say about this passage, because this passage also shows how Cohen is committing himself to noumenal affection. Now, by noumenal affection, I mean the idea that noumena, for example, our noumenal selves, initiate causal series in the phenomenal world. For Kant, famously, it's impossible for us ever to have theoretical cognition of noumenal affection. Kant thinks we can conceive of it, and it might be the case that he thinks we can grasp noumenal affection in various further ways that nevertheless fall short of theoretical cognition, but we can never have theoretical cognition of it. For Cohen, there's going to be a question about exactly what he wants to say about noumenal affection in this case. And it's going to be a question for him precisely because he's committed to it by his account of the way that theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness. So that's what I need to talk about next, how the dependence of theoretical consciousness on moral consciousness commits Cohen to noumenal affection. And the key, I think, is to notice how exactly Cohen thinks ideas can be shared between different epistemic subjects, what he hints at in this passage. Epistemic subjects do not share their ideas by means of noumenal telepathy. Noumenal subjects have no psychic powers, right? So that means that communication between subjects has to happen in the phenomenal world. Speech consists of sounds, and sounds for Cohen are vibrations in the ether. And the sounds that constitute speech are ether vibrations that are produced by muscular contractions in the throat and the mouth. If you want to think analogously, text is produced by the muscular contractions involved in grasping a pen, and the muscles involved in moving a pen from an inkwell to the page, right? So the series of events that Cohen describes in this passage is one where the will, standing apart from the phenomenal world, projects itself into that world. That is, the will initiates a causal series within the phenomenal world. And that's just noumenal affection. That is noumenal affection. So what is the upshot of all of this? Well, first of all, theoretical consciousness depends on moral consciousness, as I've just argued. Second, as I have not argued, but you can trust me on this one, moral consciousness also depends on theoretical consciousness. And then also the way that each mode of consciousness depends on the other mode of consciousness commits Cohen to noumenal affection. Okay, so having said all of that, I now want to come back to the concept of play. And I want to think about the role that play, Oh, this sentence is terrible. I want to think about the role that play plays in Cohen's system. My very sincere apologies. Okay, so let's talk about play as a rational ideal. I'm going to argue that for Cohen, play is a rational ideal that requires us continually to deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. And we're also going to see that once again, Cohen draws on Schiller developing these ideas. But before I can get to any of that, I need to start by observing that the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness poses a kind of question for Cohen. And in particular, it poses a how possible question. So why does it pose that question? Well, because we know that the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness consists in the mutual interdependence of those two modes of consciousness. And we know that that mutual interdependence involves noumenal affection. And that just leaves us with the question, how is that noumenal affection possible? In other words, how can we make noumenal affection intelligible to us? So how can we make the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness intelligible to us, intelligible to ourselves? Well, here, I think it's worth pausing and asking ourselves, what would an answer to that question even look like? So what would it even mean to understand noumenal affection? And on this point, I think it helps to think about Cohen's interpretation of things in themselves. So I want to just digress very quickly into Cohen's interpretation of things in themselves. By the time that Kant wrote Kant's Foundation of Aesthetics, he had an interpretation of the concept of things in themselves, where things in themselves express the idea of a ground for all experience. And in just this sense, the concept of things in themselves expresses an idea of an object whose representation would provide us with a complete understanding of all experience. So the concept of things in themselves thus presents itself as an ideal, a kind of teleological end to all rational inquiry. But then it follows for Cohen that the more we expand and deepen our knowledge of experience, the more our representations of the object of that experience approximates a representation of things in themselves. Of course, we will never reach a perfect representation of things in themselves. Things in themselves present us with an infinite task, and there's always going to be a gap between things in themselves and our experience. But it is a rational demand of inquiry, a demand of reason, that we continually seek to narrow that gap between how we represent experience and things in themselves. So coming back to noumenal affection, I think in a straightforwardly analogous way, we could continually deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. To see why, think about the ideal that our knowledge of experience could be so complete that we would know things in themselves. Of course, we cannot have such knowledge, but just think hypothetically. If we had knowledge that complete, our knowledge of our phenomenal selves would, at the same time, be a complete knowledge of our noumenal selves. But then our application of the principle of causality to our phenomenal selves would perfectly model the causal features of our phenomenal selves. In other words, we would have complete causal knowledge of our noumenal selves. And in that case, we would have theoretical knowledge of how our noumenal selves initiate causal series in the phenomenal world, which is to say we would have a complete causal understanding of how our noumenal selves initiate causal series in the phenomenal world, which is to say we would have a complete understanding of noumenal affection. Now, just like in the case of things in themselves, there is, I think, a demand of reason here. Reason demands that we seek continually to narrow the gap between our experience and things in themselves. So reason demands that we take it as an ideal, as an infinite task, that we could know things in themselves. By the same token, I think, reason demands that we seek continually to narrow the gap between our knowledge of our phenomenal selves and our conception of our noumenal selves. So reason demands that we take it as an ideal, as an infinite task, to develop complete understanding of noumenal affection. A complete understanding of noumenal affection is an ideal that we are rationally committed to as an ideal of rational inquiry. But what exactly is that ideal? For Cohen, the ideal of completely understanding noumenal affection is just play. Why? Well, I think we can actually see this point systematically. So we know that play is what carries out the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. But then if we understood play completely, we would have a complete understanding of that unification, including the noumenal affection that it involves. So it follows for Cohen that if we understood play completely, we would understand the unification of the two modes of consciousness, and we would understand noumenal affection. But then play just is what we seek to understand completely. It is the ideal we are rationally committed to trying to understand. So here's how Cohen expresses this idea. Since this play drive has the task of uniting the two opposing human drives, the unifying drive must be necessary, since this unity is necessary to the concept of humanity. Accordingly, it is described as a transcendental argument. And now he quotes Schiller. Reason on transcendental grounds makes this demand. Let there be a play drive. Just for the sake of people interested, those ellipses are Cohen's ellipses, not my ellipses. And then so back to Cohen, Cohen concludes by saying the play drive is a transcendental demand for the definition of humanity. Humanity just is the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness. But then the play drive is the demand to seek the conditions of the possibility of that unification. That necessarily involves the conditions that make noumenal affection possible. That is the answer to the question of how noumenal affection is possible. So for Cohen, play is a rational ideal that requires us continually to deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. Now, finally, one last point about the passage that I was just, this passage right here. This is one last instance where Cohen draws on Schiller self-consciously in order to explicate his own ideas. In this case, Cohen understands himself to be borrowing the idea from Schiller precisely that play is an ideal demanded by reason. Okay, time for a very, very quick conclusion. I've just argued that in Cohen's aesthetics, he conceives of play as a rational ideal that requires us continually to deepen our understanding of noumenal affection. And that claim, I think, follows from the combination of Cohen's conception of play as the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness, his conception of that unification as the mutual interdependence of those two modes of consciousness, and then the fact that he conceives of that interdependence in a way that commits him to noumenal affection. But I've also tried to show that when Cohen articulates these views, he does so at key points by drawing explicitly and self-consciously on Schiller in the aesthetic letters. So Cohen follows Schiller and not Kant in taking play to involve the will and moral consciousness. Cohen draws in detail on Schiller, not Kant, to develop his view of the logical role played by universal communicability in the play drive. And that's essential for understanding Cohen's view of how theoretical consciousness depends on the will. And then finally, as I've just noted a minute ago, Cohen's conception of play as an ideal, as a rational demand, is explicitly indebted to Schiller rather than to Kant. So given the centrality of play to Cohen's systematic aesthetics, I think there's maybe a plausible case to be made that Cohen's aesthetics is indebted even more to Schiller's than it is to Kant's. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So now we can open the floor for the discussion. If you have questions, please raise your hand. So I see
Let's talk their presentation. The first is, and it seems when we can answer the question from outside. We talk about play, and it would start, let's say, for a play, we would talk about, let's say, play is an anthropological history. Like physical games, but football, soccer, we can play leisure or chess or whatever, right? So play seems to be more than ordinary, right? It's something completely different from what we are talking about now. What you look at is we need to take sort of a spectrum perspective, which you need to use it to sell play or activities of reason, right? But maybe it would be interesting. Clarify this participation because you continuously talk about play and what is play? I talk about play. So I wonder how you get it started on meeting in and so how we do it. Okay, the second question is to try to make why clear the universal validity is process of universal validity.
Yeah.
And I wonder what sense of sector, because I can imagine that this plays a role as students, so to say, man, it's a phenomenal concept of the game. But on the level of pure consciousness, let's say, on the level of notion pure you say, well, he makes no sense.
Right.
So maybe you could clarify maybe more in what sense this is presupposed, and in what sense it is not presupposed, but trying to be just whether I'm correct to the whole picture. So this is the second.
I think I'm not going to give you satisfying answers because your two questions are two questions that I also have. But on the first point, with respect to the meaning of play, as you could tell, I'm in this paper, I'm talking about play exclusively in the way that Cohen defines it in the context of his systematic aesthetics. And in fact, not even all the ways, because of this play that I've attempted to spell out. Cohen also thinks it is the ideal of beauty, and literally aesthetic beauty. All of this stuff about the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness is so clearly designed to do systematic work for him in unifying his ethics and his theoretical philosophy. But of course, he also wants it to be his account of aesthetic content. And look, I can understand how play, as he discusses it in the passages that I've been talking about, unify his theoretical and practical philosophies. And I can also understand when he's talking more straightforwardly about art. I can understand what play is supposed to be, maybe, but I don't know how to connect those two things. And I think that that's probably a deep tension in Cohen's account. So that's one unsatisfying question. Here's a second, or sorry, one unsatisfying answer. Here's a second unsatisfying answer. The reason that passage that I had on the slide where Cohen is talking about speech, the reason I find that so remarkable is that, to my knowledge, it is the only place in all of Cohen's writing. I can't say this with certainty, but it's the only place in all of Cohen's writing, at least that I've found, where he talks about the generation of objectivity in terms of actual phenomenal human beings talking to each other, right? It's completely out of place. And when you think about his whole theoretical orientation, when normally he's thinking about, he's talking about some or another version of like Bewusstsein überhaupt, something like that, right? So I find this passage really, really remarkable. And it seems to be just this one place where he feels some kind of obligation to talk about what it would be for a bunch of scientists to be standing around in their lab talking about their work, and how scientists talking about their work and publishing physical papers is a necessary part of the process of generating universally valid knowledge. But it's so out of character that I find it remarkable, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it. Again, a very unsatisfying answer.
So, Professor Arton?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I can follow your argumentation very well. I have 2 points. The first is, you got to my question yesterday. You say more about the social dimension of play in Schiller and Cohen. Yeah, way above. And the second is a remark from halfway, looking back on the period around 1900. If questions, moral questions, ethical questions are shifting to the aesthetic dimension, is this a symptom of resignation?
Oh.
Yeah, I would say that if you can't solve the political and moral problems, it's, for me, it's obvious. And in our time, this could be an analogous situation that we are going to the aesthetic dimension and say, well, there we have this process of idealization, self-optimization, whatever. And this is only an aesthetic, and all the political things become an aesthetic thing.
Yeah.
As it's too far away, it's too.
Well, I don't think so, but I think it speaks very directly to how Cohen is using Schiller. I mean, further to what I was just saying, right? Cohen, his interest seems to be in like systematic critical idealism, and I think I can remember Cohen mentioning in an offhand way that for Schiller, the unification of theoretical and moral consciousness is facilitated or carried out by cultural institutions. I mean, it's not like he denies it, but he doesn't care. It's simply not what he's talking about. And his use of Schiller is exclusively to build his critical system, and at least at this point in his writings, has no interest in those cultural considerations. And so the conception of play that he comes up with is not going to do the work that you want, and indeed that Schiller wanted play to do. It's simply not going to do that work. Did that answer your question? Sort of. Okay.
So next question from Professor Beiser.
Thank you for your account of Cohen's aesthetics, which was much better than mine. Oh, sorry. Okay. But I have 2 questions about what Cohen is doing. Is he aware of how much he's endangering Kant's architectonic and how much he's going beyond Kantian limits? And this seems to me they allow the will to play an important part in theoretical cognition, seems to undermine the autonomy of theoretical cognition, which was a very important point for Kant.
Yep.
That without such autonomy, there can't be Wissenschaft, there can't be science.
Right.
And then also this knowledge of noumenal affection, you can't have that according to Kant. And I just don't see how Cohen he just seems to be going for the sake of systematic goals. He just seems to be blundering on and ignoring these limits. I don't see where he's actually observing those limits or trying to reason why he's going beyond them. This just seems to me systematicity for its own sake. And that's just Begriffsspiel. Because this should have no significance as philosophy. I'm really troubled by this.
So I think I agree with absolutely everything you said right up until the very end. So in a variety of ways, or I'm interested in a number of ways where Cohen in the 1880s is making moves that he himself does not realize are pushing him farther and farther away from Kant. So not to get too deep into it, but I think the 1880s are where you can find in Cohen the seeds of his later fully mature system. And in all the ways that 10 and 20 years later, he recognizes that he has left Kant behind. I think in the 1880s, he is starting to leave Kant behind, but very often he does not recognize that that's what he's doing. He just doesn't have the clarity of thinking at that point. So how is he thinking about his relationship to Kant here? I actually think it's helpful to think about, Rudolf, you were talking about like the continuity thesis that most of these neo-Kantians have. And I think that's, despite the fact that I was emphasizing Cohen's debts to Schiller and the ways that he disagrees with Kant, and Cohen will acknowledge those disagreements with Kant, but he always does it when he's talking about his kind of Schillerian influences. He always acknowledges those disagreements with Kant, in the manner of, well, here's a place where Schiller just corrected something that Kant didn't quite get right, or here's a place where Schiller perfected what Kant was trying to do. He still kind of understands himself to be deeply Kantian, because he wants to think of Schiller as kind of like getting Kant right on a few points, even more right than Kant did. But that also speaks to the fact that Cohen, at this point, really does not understand how deeply he's departing from Kant. No, sorry, but the very last point is, for me, this is precisely what's interesting, right? Seeing a philosopher in that state of confusion where they don't completely understand their own views, and we have the benefit of understanding where those views are going to be in 20 years, and we can say, I can see what's happening here and you can't, right? That's what's interesting to me. Right.
So the last question comes from Paolo Pesce.
Any questions? When you were saying that the Cohen side with Schiller concerning the play and the play of faculties, as he mentions blind, because I was thinking that maybe it's kind of reassessing the very faculties that involve in reason, but we can't force introduce reason in this idea of play of faculties and blind. And so I don't know whether Cohen takes himself as siding with Schiller, or maybe something was happening in Schiller with the merge of the two accounts, sublime and beautiful. That's my first question. And the second is, could he think also of an element of account of the role of the will in movement when he deals with this role of the will in the very faculty, because he had commented on Helmholtz in his Lager recently, and there's a role, a very important role of the will in nine movements and all sorts of perception in Helmholtz, who falls Fichte and source. So might be also behind going back to something that's later on is.
I mean, to take your first question first, I'm going to give you the very same very unsatisfying answer that I've already given, which is, yes, Cohen talks about the sublime, and he talks about play in connection with the sublime. And I, other than the fact that for systematic reasons, he needs beauty in the sublime to be connected to play, as I've elaborated his conception of play, he needs there to be that connection. I can't really understand what the connection is supposed to be. It seems totally artificial that he has this conception of the unification of moral, theoretical and moral consciousness. And then is like, and that's beauty in the sublime. Thank you. What does any of this have to do with art or looking at a mountain or, your second question is very much a question that I also have, and precisely because I find it so remarkable in this passage that he's talking about universal validity as if it's something that you and I, in our phenomenal selves, generate through speaking in the phenomenal world. And I genuinely wonder what exactly he's responding to in that passage. Helmholtz has accounts of the role of the will in theoretical cognition. Multiple positivists talk about speech and the role of speech in producing shared knowledge. So this is certainly something that, excuse me, Ernst Mach talks about this. I don't know if Cohen is reading Mach. Ernst Lass has passages where he talks about this, and Cohen is Avenarius, but Cohen for sure is reading Lass. So I kind of wonder if this extremely uncharacteristic passage about the role of the will in producing theoretical knowledge, it has something to do with Cohen feeling pressure from some positivists, maybe, because it's so out of place in his writing. But Helmholtz is a possible source of that pressure, right?
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
I would ask Ezio Gamba to come here. The slides.
Grazie.
PDF o PowerPoint?
È uguale, è definito più comodo e ti fanno venire bene.
Okay. So, short presentation for Ezio. Ezio Gamba is a professor at the University of Turin, and he worked on the connection between neo-Kantianism and the problem of philosophy, religion, and art in their connection to critical philosophy. He wrote some papers on Hermann Cohen's aesthetics, and that's also what he's going to talk about to us today. And his talk is titled Aesthetic Education and Self-Consciousness of Humankind, Schiller and Cohen's Thought. So, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I want to thank the organizers for this invitation, clearly. So, my talk needs some preliminary remarks. The first is that we have short remarks about Schiller in several of Cohen's writings, but a true extensive examination of Schiller's thought is something we can find mainly or almost exclusively in his aesthetic writing, and above all in his two main books about aesthetics, Begründung der Ästhetik and der Ästhetik and Aesthetic Training of Philosophy. Second remark, even if Cohen was deeply engaged with philosophical consideration of art in the first phase of his activity, and also in the last years of his activity, this interest was not continuous through his life, but we can see three short periods of his thought when he studied and wrote about aesthetics. And these three periods are separated by two long intervals of silence about aesthetic questions. So I start with the first period. The first period is also Cohen's earliest philosophical productive phase. Cohen was born in 1842, so he was very young in this first period. And he was working within the context of Maurice Lazarus and Damon Steinthal, psychology of peoples. At this stage, Cohen cannot yet be defined as a neo-Kantian philosopher. He didn't begin yet his study of Kant's philosophy, and his interests of research were far from transcendental questions. His main interest of research belonged to a field that we can define as psychology of art, more than philosophical aesthetic. Among these three periods, this is clearly the least significant, both for Cohen's place in the history of philosophy and also for the topic of today. But in his longest and most ambitious work of this period, that is Die dikterische Fantasie unter der Mechanismus des Bewusstseins, Cohen expresses a critical stance toward Schiller. Indeed, in this essay, he discussed several passages drawn from Schiller's on naive and sentimental aesthetic, poetry. In this essay, Cohen aims to explain the origin of poetry, both in the sense of its historical emergence at the dawn of culture, and in the sense of the way each individual poem comes into being. His approach, in line with Lazarus and Steinthal, is fundamentally psychological. For Cohen, explaining the origin of poetry means explaining the emergence of a complex of Vorstellungen, of representations, and the specific connection between them. These representations and these interconnections are characteristics of poetry, as opposed to the representations and the connections that are typical of science, or more broadly, of reliable knowledge of reality. Cohen provides a psychophysiological theory, a psychophysiological account of the origin of this representation that is grounded in a general psychological theory, a mechanistic theory of consciousness that is derived from Albert. For the purpose of this talk, we don't need to go into details into this theory of consciousness, of origin of poetry. What matters here now is that Cohen contrasts his view of poetry with an opposite view. That is the idea that art is basically beyond explication. Cohen sees this this view, as a modern reinterpretation of the ancient notion according to which poetry is a gift of the gods, and the poet or human being can only receive it in a state of divine madness, without happening what is happening. Many modern authors who have thought about artistic creation believe that in poetry or art, the artist's rationality, consciousness, and will are passive in the face of a power that is not a god, it is not external to them, but is a part of them. They call it the genius. Genius is a Latin word that means a divine being. So it's clear that it is the modern version of that ancient thought. But, Cohen says, this way of thinking doesn't really help us understand the origin of art of poetry, because it is basically the admission that there is nothing to understand. The poetry is beyond explication. Clearly, against this, Cohen argues for the explanatory power of mechanistic psychology. Clearly, Kant's presentation of the aesthetics of genius is not meant to be a detailed reconstruction of any single theory of artistic representation. Rather, it offers a general overview of a shared horizon of aesthetic reflections by various authors, even if their philosophical principles differ greatly. Among these authors, Cohen mentions Schiller, alongside with Friedrich Theodor Fischer, Schelling, Jacob Grimm, and some others. Coming to Schiller, Cohen quotes a few passages from On Naive and Sentimental Poetry about genius as a legislator and about the immortality of the spirit of poetry in humanity, in humankind. Since this phase of Cohen's philosophy is the least important of the three, I won't go into details. What is important here is the general picture. That is that Cohen reproaches Schiller and others for hindering the development of a scientific understanding of poetry by defending the idea that poetry is mysterious and beyond explanation. So, the dikterische Fantasie und der Mechanismus des Bewusstseins is the most ambitious work by Cohen in this period, but it is also the last one. His encounter with Kant's philosophy marked a turning point. Cohen abandoned psychology, turned to transcendental philosophy, and from then on, his concern was no longer the quaestio facti of the explanation of psychological processes, but the quaestio iuris about the conditions of validity of knowledge. This change took him away from aesthetics for almost 20 years, during which he wrote no aesthetic reflections in his writing or just some short remarks. When he eventually came back to aesthetics with a different perspective, he would not have endorsed many of the theses expressed in the dikterische Fantasie. For example, he no longer criticized the use of the concept of genius. As a result, his evaluation of some of the authors just some of the authors he has criticized in that early essay changed quite radical, and Schiller was one of them. So, second period. At the end of this long period of silence about aesthetics, Cohen's come back to this discipline happens with a whole book of great commitment, that is his third book of interpretation of Kant's thought, Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, preceded by an essay entitled Jubiläumsbetrachtungen. Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik is Cohen's work in which Cohen devotes more attention to Schiller's thought. It is Cohen's third book on Kant's thought, after Kant's Theorie der Erfahrung and Kant's Begründung der Ethik. In the opening words of Kant's Theorie der Ästhetik, Cohen presents this book as the first part of a 20-year endeavor of studying and interpreting Kant's philosophy. However, as the immediately following lines of the book clearly show, this statement must be understood as Cohen's retrospective judgment on the path we went through, not as the declaration of having completed a plan devised from the start. This trilogy of books, the structure of which clearly follows the order of Kant's three critiques, is not the result of a project conceived by its author from the beginning. In Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, we find, with regard to Schiller, a general judgment by Cohen on his thought, a specific examination of some of his theses, and an enthusiastic celebration of this poetry. However, the point I want to stress is an aspect of Cohen's reflection in Schiller that emerges on a page when Schiller is not even mentioned by name, and it has to do with the overall structure of Cohen's philosophical system. More broadly, we can say that each aspect of Cohen's attitude toward Schiller is tied to the question of philosophy as a system. In Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, the problem of the foundation of philosophical aesthetics and the problem of the philosophy as a system are deeply intertwined. From a historical standpoint, Cohen sees Kant as the founder both of philosophical aesthetics and of philosophy as a system. It is important to note that recognizing Kant in both roles does not mean attributing to him two separate and unrelated achievements. On the contrary, according to Cohen, only by grounding aesthetics on its authentic foundation and granting it full philosophical dignity, could Kant make philosophy authentically systematic. Cohen's reason for stating this close relationship between the historical foundation of aesthetics and the foundation of the system of philosophy is the completeness of Kant's enterprise. By taking into consideration scientific knowledge of nature, morality, and art, Kant examined all the fundamental fields of culture. The third part of Kant's system, namely aesthetics, is also the last one. Therefore, only through aesthetics does philosophy achieve its systematic completeness and become a true system. For this reason, according to Cohen, the meaning of Kant's transcendental thought as a system of philosophy and its overall structure can be understood only through the examination of Kant's aesthetics. The endeavor of founding a philosophical aesthetics as a part of a system of philosophy, the first parts of which are philosophy of knowledge, of theory, of experience, and ethics, means founding aesthetic as an autonomous discipline. Autonomous, it must have its own principle. It cannot be reduced to a branch of one of the first two parts or to their sum. As autonomous discipline that is equal in dignity to the other parts, but that also has a specific place and role in the system, and necessary relationships with the other parts. Clearly, this place of aesthetics within the system of philosophy corresponds to the role of art in the systematic unity of culture. It remains autonomous from both scientific knowledge and morality, and cannot be reduced to one of them or to their sum. Yet it is necessary relationship with both. This is what, according to Cohen, Schiller and Goethe understood well. From the introduction of the book, Cohen expresses a clear appreciation for their historical role, presenting them as the disciples of Kant. By this, Cohen means that they were the authors who best understood and continued Kant's project of the foundation of an aesthetics that is both autonomous from other philosophical disciplines and aware of its necessary relations with them. This assessment becomes even more explicit in the final chapter, entitled The Critic Aesthetics, Its Friends and Its Enemies. Here, Cohen shows that in the 2 or 3 generations following Kant, aesthetics has been developed by authors that continued Kant's endeavor to found an autonomous aesthetics within the system of philosophy and to acknowledge the validity and autonomy of art within the systematic unity of culture, but also by authors who denied this autonomy of art or its specific place and role within the systematic unity of culture. The first are the disciples of Kant, the friends of the systematic aesthetic, among which Schiller is the most relevant for the systematic character of philosophical aesthetics. The enemies are the Romantics, who misunderstood the relationship between art and the other fields of culture. This general judgment is supported by an analysis of Schiller's and Goethe's reflections on specific concepts in Kant's philosophy. In particular, Cohen discusses Schiller's treatment of the notions of idea, of the subjectivity of the judgment of taste, of the concept of form, and of play, as we have just listened. Also here, I cannot go into details, but this positive judgment of Schiller and Goethe as Kant disciples is also tied to a general appreciation of German classical poetry and music. The very possibility of grasping the place of art within the systematic unity of culture, Cohen suggests, arose from the extraordinary flourishing of poetry and music in Germany, and in turn, it also nourished that flourishing. The closing pages of the book are a celebration of German poetry and music, where Schiller and Goethe are praised as Germany's greatest poets. Despite all the reflections and evaluations that Cohen has devoted to Schiller in Kant's aesthetic, the point I want to stress is the one that directly concerns Cohen's own idea of the philosophical system. In this book, Cohen defines the conception of philosophy as a system in which aesthetics forms the last part. We have already seen one reason for this. For Cohen, Kant is the true founder of philosophy as a system precisely because his work is complete. By dealing with scientific knowledge, morality, and art, he covered all the fundamental domains of culture. Still, one might raise it up. Why only these three? Why these three are all the fields of culture? Cohen's answer comes out in the development of his aesthetic theory in Kant, the Grund der Ästhetik. He argues that both scientific knowledge and morality play an essential role in art, and that art is precisely the place where these two domains find their unity, their synthesis, their harmonious conciliation. In art, culture reaches its completeness, reconciling in harmony the knowledge of nature and the demands of morality, the kingdom of nature and the kingdom of ends. As Cohen writes, the idea of personality is the moral idea that is absolutely not founded in feeling. The homo noumenum, which is founded by the task of feeling, is the human being of humanity. The moral noumenum is the human being of freedom, who divides nature and morality. The aesthetic one, the aesthetic human noumenum, is the human being of harmony, who reconciles nature and morality. The moral human being is the human being of duty and ultimate end. The aesthetic human being is the human being of participation and sympathy, who ennobles also intermediate ends as simile, ultimate ends. This is a quotation. Hence, Cohen's solemn statement that art is the self-consciousness of humankind. Art is the self-consciousness of humankind. Clearly, this view of art can be considered as deriving from Kant's statement that the power of judgment is a Mittelglied, an intermediary between understanding and reason in its practical use, or that the feeling of pleasure and displeasure is an intermediary between the faculty of cognition and the faculty of desire. However, Cohen's stance goes far beyond the statement, as Kant certainly did not think that art could be the intermediary between scientific knowledge and morality, and even less that it could be a kind of synthesis or harmonious conciliation of the two self-consciousness of humankind. Regarding the view of art, Cohen clearly acknowledges the relevance of Schiller's thought in developing the fundamental thesis of Kant's aesthetics beyond Kant himself. On the page preceding his solemn statement that art is the self-consciousness of humankind, Cohen, even if he does not mention Schiller by name here, acknowledges the relevance of the idea of the aesthetic education of humankind as a consistent and precious development of Kant's thought for the development of a complete and precise view of art and of its role in culture overall, and so also for the establishing of a true understanding of the system which philosophy is called to build. It should, however, be clear that this view of art as the self-consciousness of humankind is inconsistent with Cohen's view both of the general structure of the system of philosophy and of culture as a whole. This inconsistency lies in the fact that in Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, aesthetics play a dual role within the system. It is both the transcendental discipline that completes is both the transcendental philosophical discipline focused on art as a specific field of culture, and the discipline that completes the system by founding the unity of culture and bringing the fields that are object of the previous parts of the system to their synthesis or harmonious conciliation. Clearly, the consistency of these two roles of aesthetics can be defined only by accepting, Cohen actually do it in this book, the bold statement that scientific knowledge of nature and morality find their unity or their conciliation in art, which therefore is the self-consciousness of mankind. However, if this statement implies that scientific knowledge of nature and morality achieve their full value only when they are assumed in art, this would clearly be unacceptable for them. This inconsistency in Cohen's view of the system of philosophy, of the systematic unity of culture, and of the role of art in it has been corrected by Cohen in his System der Philosophie, and above all, in its third part, Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls. So we come to the third period of Cohen's aesthetics. After Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, Cohen entered a new period of silence on aesthetic questions. Although the silence was not completely uninterrupted, we can say that it essentially lasted until 1912, when he published Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls. On the contrary, once Cohen returned to aesthetics in 1912, he never left the field again until his death. Later works contain quite a few pages on aesthetic question. However, as far as Cohen's stance on Schiller's thought is concerned, only Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls can be considered a truly relevant source in this period. Cohen's main aesthetic work, Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls, is like Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, the third part of a philosophical trilogy, which is titled System der Philosophie. Its first two parts are Logik der reinen Kenntnis and Ethik des reinen Willens. Clearly, this systematic trilogy follows the same pattern of Cohen's trilogy devoted to Kant's thought, neo-theology, ethic, and aesthetics. However, we must note at least two differences between the two trilogies, aside from the simple fact that the first is a trilogy of books about Kant, while the second is the expression of an autonomously developed system of philosophy. The first difference is that Cohen's System der Philosophie was conceived from the beginning as a unitary systematic project. The second difference, which is more relevant to the topic of today, is that while the first trilogy presents itself as complete, without need or possibility to have more parts, the System der Philosophie was not intended to have only three parts. There was meant to be a fourth part with, after logic, ethics, and aesthetics, would have been psychology. The psychology, unlike the other three parts of the system, was not intended to be a critical examination of a specific field of culture, but rather a retrospective view that philosophy, after the first part, can cast on culture as a whole to grasp its unity. However, the book devoted to psychology was never written. In his System der Philosophie, Cohen no longer supports this view, the view of art as the self-consciousness of humankind, and deeply rethinks the role of aesthetics within the system. The inconsistency present in Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik is eliminated by the addition of the fourth part of the system, psychology. The task of being the moment in which the system achieves its unity is removed from aesthetics, which is thus exclusively focused, like the first two parts of the system, on the foundation of a specific field of culture, that is art. Within the context of Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls, therefore, Cohen's theory that scientific knowledge of nature and morality serve as preconditions for art by providing it with its materials does not raise the suspicion of implying that they find their true validity only in art itself. This change in Cohen's view of the system of philosophy leads him to adopt a more critical stance toward Schiller and his concept of the aesthetical education of humankind. In Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls, Schiller is still regarded by Cohen as a model of genuine philosophical engagement by a great artist, one who reflects on art not in an amateurish way, disregarding the history of philosophy and the solutions other thinkers have already proposed, but with true historical competence, particularly with regard to Kant. Also, Cohen's appreciation of Schiller as a German poem is maintained in this work. In discussing the theme of freedom as central to Schiller's dramatic output, Cohen describes Schiller as our true national poet. However, Cohen does not examine specific philosophical theses proposed by Schiller, nor does he praise him for the position of any particular problem. On the contrary, for example, on the very page where he most clearly acknowledges Schiller's philosophical engagement, Cohen also expresses skepticism about the possibility of regarding ancient Greek poetry as truly naive. However, it is above all Schiller's concept of aesthetic education that is criticized by Cohen. once again without mentioning Schiller by name. In the final pages of the fourth chapter, Cohen devotes his attention to the error of the German spiritual life, that after Kant and his classic age turned to Romanticism. The concept of aesthetic education is the medium for this shift from classic age to Romanticism. According to Cohen, this concept is born from enthusiasm for art and for the fact that art saves and safeguards human dignity. As a consequence of this enthusiasm, some German authors means Schiller clearly, thought that art can lead to morality. On the contrary, morality cannot be founded by art, because it is its precondition. Art can bring morality to a human dignity to expression, but it cannot found them. Art can give the moral subject a face and a figure, representing it in the unity of body and soul. In doing so, it can liberate the moral subject, that is human being as universality, from its conceptual expression, by making it an object of love. Yet, the foundation of this moral subject, of humankind as a subject, belongs to ethics alone. By contrast, the concept of aesthetic education suggests that art itself can provide a foundation for morality, a foundation superior to that offered by ethics alone. As we have already seen in Kant's Begründung Aesthetic, immediately after discussing aesthetics education, Cohen makes his solemn statement that art is the self-consciousness of humankind. By contrast, in Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls, his discussion of aesthetic education of humankind concludes with an equally solemn assertion that can be seen as a correction of the earlier claim. Love for the human being is the self-feeling of humankind in the human being. There is no relevant difference in the first part of the sentence, because love for the human being is a feeling that founds art. The difference is in that in the earlier sentence, Cohen writes self-consciousness, self-bewusstsein. In the second sentence, he wrote self-feeling. So art, this feeling is not consciousness as a whole. It is feeling. It is a direction of consciousness, along with knowledge and will. It is not consciousness as a whole. Cohen's shift in his view of the system of philosophy is thus closely intertwined with his distancing from Schiller. This is Cohen's evaluation of Schiller as a philosopher in Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls. However, things are a little different for Schiller as a poet. In Kant's Begründung der Ästhetik, indeed, there is no analysis of specific works of poetry of art. So Cohen's final celebrations of Goethe's and Schiller's poetry is as enthusiastic as vague. On the contrary, in Aesthetic des reinen Gefühls, Cohen devotes much attention to precise examination and evaluation of specific works of art. This happens above all in the second part of the work. Some of Schiller's works are discussed in the chapter on lyric poetry and only one on drama. In both cases, however, Schiller is considered alongside or in comparison with Goethe, and Cohen's focus in these discussions is predominantly on Goethe rather than Schiller. Moreover, in the chapter on lyric poetry, where the only poem by Schiller to be discussed by Cohen is Andy Freuden's, Cohen sees the feature of this poem as the proof that Schiller's lyric poetry has not the same perfection, the same maturity as Goethe's. Only in the chapter about drama, where Cohen expresses some consideration about Don Carlos and Wallenstein, Schiller's work is object of an appreciation without reserve. So this is the overview of Cohen's judgment and reflection of Schiller through his work. We can have some conclusion. First, the judgment changes with time from a total appreciation and a positive influence by Schiller on Cohen to a distancing, a judgment of Schiller as the intermediary through Kant and Romanticism. Second, Cohen has a clear sympathy for Schiller, even when he does not agree with Schiller, even when he criticizes Schiller, he presents its criticism in a context of a positive general evaluation. Finally, a last remark. My overview of Schiller's presence and role in Cohen's thought is focused only on Cohen's explicit reflections on Cohen's explicit reflection on Schiller. But it is probably possible to detect a more hidden, subterranean presence of Schiller in Cohen's work. This would not take the form of direct confrontation with Schiller's writing, but rather of Schiller's influence on Cohen's own philosophical thesis. The clearest case of this influence can be found in Cohen's theory, first formulated in Kant's Grundstating and later taken up even with important modification in aesthetic design and diffuse, that beauty consists of two moments, the sublime and the humor. The difference between these two moments lies in the predominance of knowledge in the one and of morality in the other. The family resemblance with Schiller's theory in the letters on the aesthetic education of humankind, where he distinguishes two kinds of beauty, is clear. But tracing this influence in detail and investigating the possible mediations through which Schiller's ideas reached Cohen and were transformed into his own thought would require a separate and more demanding line of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezio. And now the floor is open for discussion. So let's see, a question from Chiara.
Okay, so thank you for this broad mapping of Schiller's presence in Cohen's work. So my question is, and probably you have answered already at the end of your talk, as you mentioned, and as we know, Schiller was a national poet, and it was part of the curriculum at school. So a lot of philosophers usually also mention quite extensively Schiller's poems in their work. But it seems to me that Cohen's really focuses only on Schiller's treatises, so it is more philosophical. Is it possible to say so? And if it is possible to say so, since you mentioned at the end that in Cohen's examination of the poem, he only mentions anti-Freud and criticizes it. Is it because he doesn't think that it is possible to do philosophy poetically? Is it imperfect because it fails on a poetical level or on a theoretical philosophical level? Schiller's philosophical poems.
I don't understand the last sentence. It fails Schiller's face, or Schiller's philosophical poetry fails.
That you say that he criticized
Freud.
Criticizing because it's lacking. Is it lacking poetically or philosophically? So it is like a Cohen's skepticism about philosophical poems in general, or
no. So in the first two periods of the three periods I mentioned, it is clear that Cohen examines only Schiller's theoretical works. In the first period, only on naive and sentimental poetry. In Kant's Begründung Ästhetik, there is an attention to many writings by Schiller, Callias Brief, and above all, aesthetic education of humankind, but also others, letters with between Schiller and Goethe, Schiller and Humboldt. In the third phase, it's more complicated. Cohen clearly praised Schiller's dramas. There is not a deep analysis of these dramas. as for many other poets, but there is there are some considerations about that. For lyrics, Cohen praises in general Schiller philosophical poetry as the engagement of a true artist who makes philosophy with full consciousness and full competence. And he remarks that that Schiller's philosophical poetry is not Gedankendichtung, it's not philosophy translated into verses, but it is true poetry. However, he does not mention a single poem. It is a general evaluation, but it does not mention or takes into consideration a single poem. No, just Andy Freud. And in Andy Freud, Cohen's problem is that lyrical poetry in its maturity, its completeness, is the expression of a love between an I and a you. A you that is a single subject. And Schiller's Andy Freud is expression of a love for humankind, no? Zeitumschlungen Millionen, millions of persons, not you, but millions. And it becomes a kind of religious love. But Cohen's judgment of this is that it does not release completely the characteristic, the specific features of lyric, that is expression of love for you. And Cohen's judgment is that this impersonality of Andy Freud, that is typical of popular songs, and also of romantic poetry, according to him, it's not love, because this is not a precise term. Is on the contrary, is the yearning, the longing to be loved, to have some, not to love some, not of love for someone, but to have someone to love. And as according to Cohen, is typical of romanticism. And so, like the concept of aesthetic education, also this single poem, that is the only one he quotes, only this single poem is an intermediary between classical German poetry and romantic poetry.
Thank you very much for that. I want to ask about this idea that art is the subconsciousness of beauty time. And I mean, that really is clear. As you very nicely put it, in constituting the systematically and as the specific way of aesthetic ways. And that statement is where those two areas come together. Right?
Yes.
So I guess the question is, how much do you think Cohen really thinks about art conceived in that way? And how much is that, like that thing that art is the self-consciousness of humanity? How much does that come from reflection on the nature of art and aesthetics? And how much does that come from the fact that he simply needs art to occupy that role in the system? Does that question make sense?
Yes. Okay. I really don't know. But I think that is a problem that goes on the limit between history of philosophy, intellectual biography, and psychology of author. And I have to confess my limit. I came from a school where for all my formation, they have given to me the idea that the psychology of the author is not my job, it's not my duty, it's not my okay. So, but here Cohen is a problem. He must deal with art, and he must close the system. Clear that these two tasks converge here. He tried to make it converge, but it is clear that there is an inconsistency. And there is also a claim that can be satisfied. That is the claim that we can give an exhaustive list of the important fields of culture, as with science, morality, and art. We have everything in our culture. But we can't have religion, we can't have language, we can't have many other things, myth. Where is the place for this? So I think that the idea that the final part of the system, the moment for the unity of system is external. No, it's a new part, external to the single part, devoted to single fields of culture, is a way to solve this problem. It's a way to state the possibility that we can have even more fields without giving away the possibility of having a conclusive and unitarian moment. No, we can also add parts to the system. We can without renouncing to psychology, but it is beyond the letter of one. I don't know.
Okay, so I'm afraid we run out of time. So thank you, Ezio. And now we have a coffee break, so we'll reconvene in half an hour here.